Hey everybody, it's the History Teacher. In this episode, we'll examine the Black Death. The Black Death refers to an outbreak of bubonic plague in Europe between 1347 and the 1360s, which killed between 30 and 60% of the European population, perhaps 50 million people. The bubonic plague is caused by the Yersinia pestis virus. People suffering from plague develop painful, dark swellings in their lymph glands located under the armpits, in the neck, and in the groin. The Greek word for groin is bubo, and that's the origin of the word bubonic in bubonic plague. People would die within days, sometimes within 24 hours, of being infected. The plague was transmitted to humans by being bitten by infected fleas. Until recently, it was thought that infected fleas carried by black rats brought the plague into Europe. But recent research suggests that fleas carried by gerbils, not rats, were the source of the pandemic. Bubonic plague originates in Asia and flourishes under climatic conditions that are poor for rats, but great for gerbils. Gerbils infected by plague followed people along the trade routes from Asia to the Mediterranean. From there, these tiny creatures entered ships bound for Europe. Wherever the gerbils went, the fleas they carried jumped off and bit people, spreading the plague with every bite. The first recorded outbreak in Europe was in October 1347 at the port of Messina in Sicily. That same year it was in Constantinople, Athens, and Florence. In 1348 it would appear in Paris, London, and Barcelona. By the following year the pandemic would span from Lisbon to the city of Buda and all the way up to Scandinavia. Mortality in cities was especially high. Medieval cities were densely crowded and dirty, conditions which accelerated the spread of the disease. Human excrement, trash, and animal carcasses were often dumped in the streets. People's immune systems were relatively weak due to poor nutrition. Medieval people didn't know that disease was caused by organisms invisible to the naked eye. What people witnessed were their friends, family, and acquaintances suddenly, without apparent cause, growing hideous swellings all over their body, then soon after dropping dead. People were understandably terrified. In many towns and villages of England, for example, half the population would disappear within months. Can you imagine if, 8 weeks from now, half the people you know were dead, without knowing why or whether you'd be next? That was the experience of medieval Europeans during the Black Death. Only those living in isolated rural areas, or who fled to the countryside, were relatively safe, but nowhere was secure. In this intensely religious age, many people believed that the plague was caused by God as punishment for wicked human ways. Some people, referred to as the flagellates, whipped themselves bloody to try to atone for their sins. In cities in France, Germany, Flanders, and elsewhere, Jews were massacred in the belief that they caused the plague by poisoning the wells. But in fact, the Yersinia pestis virus didn't discriminate, and Jewish people were not spared. When the pestilence finally passed, the survivors inhabited a shattered world. Economies throughout Europe drastically shrank because of the enormous drop in population. The Catholic Church, perhaps the most significant institution in medieval Europe, was decimated by the plague. Priests who tended the sick were especially vulnerable to catching the disease. In some villages throughout Europe, there were no priests left alive to conduct funerals, marriages, or other clerical functions. The disaster of the plague was reflected in contemporary art and literature. La Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, was a visual art motif meant to remind people that death is everywhere and comes to everyone. It depicts human skeletons eerily dancing. Cadaver tombs also appeared in the wake of the plague. These are stone burial boxes on which are carved a corpse in a state of advanced decomposition. Only wealthy or high-status people could afford stone tombs. So the message of cadaver tombs was that, no matter a person's richness or rank, everyone was destined for death and physical decay. In literature, the plague was written about in two of the most important works of the Middle Ages, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Boccaccio's Decameron. Although life was bleak in the aftermath of the plague, there were some benefits for survivors apart from their lives. Because so many people died, there was a shortage of labor, which boosted wages for available workers. Serfdom declined as peasants left manors to take advantage of the demand for labor in towns and cities. Suddenly, poor people had opportunities to advance their status and their incomes. The economic and social empowerment of peasants threatened rich and powerful people who had always controlled society. The rich needed peasant labor, but didn't want to pay them higher wages, nor lose control of the peasantry. In England, one response was the Statute of Labours in 1351, which restricted wage increases and barred peasants from leaving their lords' manors to seek better employment. The goal was to ensure that the rich and powerful controlled where peasants worked and how much they were paid, as had always been the case, despite the new circumstances brought about by the plague. But times had indeed changed. In France and England, peasants, artisans, and townspeople were required to pay higher taxes to fund the ongoing 100 Years' War between France and England. Resentment about higher taxes and restrictions on wages and movement eventually turned into open revolt. In northern France in 1358, peasants revolted in an episode called the Jacquerie, which was crushed by the nobles but badly frightened them. In England, a tax increase in 1381 sparked the so-called Peasants Revolt, led by Wat Tyler and a preacher named John Ball. About 100,000 people participated in the uprising. The rebels' demands included reduced taxes, the end of serfdom, and lower rents for land. The 14-year-old king, Richard II, agreed to these demands in order to disperse the rebellion, but afterward reneged on his promises, and many of the leaders of the rebellion were executed. Nevertheless, serfdom did soon disappear in England and Europe generally. The post-plague economy required greater freedom of movement. Similar peasant insurrections happened in Spain, Sicily, and Germany. The people who had managed to survive the plague weren't content to let only the elite inherit the earth, not without a struggle at least. The Black Death subsided by the early 1360s, but there would be new outbreaks through the 1700s, including a devastating one in London in 1665. The episode of the Black Death shows the profound impact of disease on human events. Microscopic Yersinia pestis managed to transform whole societies. All right, that's it for now. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.